At my daughter's wedding, I reached for the chair they'd set out for me. Before I could sit down, her fiancé snatched it back. The sound of wood scraping against the floor echoed louder than the orchestra, louder than the whispers of the guests, even louder than the pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought maybe it was an accident. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below telling me what time it is where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single second. This story is going to keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Maybe Jasper hadn't seen me reach out. Maybe it was just awkward timing. But then he smirked, that cruel, sharp smirk, the kind that tells you this isn't a mistake, it's a message. Laughter rang out across several tables, muffled by polite handshakes. Others gasped. Most just looked away, their eyes on the chandeliers, the flowers, anywhere but me. As if my humiliation was contagious and they feared it. I stood there frozen, my hand still in the air as if it hadn't yet registered the betrayal my eyes were witnessing. My daughter Vivian turned her head toward me. For a moment I prayed that she would come to my defense, that she would say, "Jasper, stop, that's my dad." But her lips were pressed together, stiff and unyielding, and she adjusted the hem of her dress as if nothing had happened. In that instant, the white veil that had covered my hopes for this day collapsed. This wasn't an accident. This was planned. Why here? Why in front of everyone? My knees shook. I had imagined this day so many times, sitting proudly, watching my only daughter walk down the aisle, blessing her, shedding tears of joy. But instead I was left standing in the middle of the room, stripped of my dignity, abandoned by the child I had raised through sleepless nights and endless sacrifices. Memories flashed through my mind, uninvited but relentless. I saw Vivian as a little girl, standing beside me in the kitchen, her small hands reaching up to hold my fingers, her voice calling out "Daddy," innocently filling the house with warmth. I had promised to protect her then, just as I had promised to protect her now. But where was she now? A pang of pain rose in my chest, and I swallowed it down. The woman she had become, the woman standing beside that boy, no longer had room for the love that had once blossomed between us. I had raised her to be strong, to stand up for what was right, to value herself above all else. But here she was, bowing to the whims of a man who thought he could dishonor her own flesh and blood without consequence. I could feel Nancy's eyes on me, Vivian's new mother-in-law. She didn't bother to hide her satisfaction. She leaned back in her chair, sipping her champagne, her smile like sharp glass. She had always despised me, always sought to erase me from Vivian's life. Today, she had succeeded, and still no one moved. Not Sam, not Maria, not even my own brothers and sisters who sat in the back row pretending not to see. They all sat still, complicit in their silence. The orchestra picked up again, strings swelling as if the music could sweep away the violence of the gesture. But it was more than a gesture. It was a statement: "You don't belong here." My throat burned, but no sound came out. My body screamed to run. But my feet felt nailed to the polished floor. I felt eyes crawling over my skin, each whispering a different version of the same question. What did she do to deserve this? I had to swallow the scream that was rising inside me, because the truth was I didn't know what I did, or maybe I did, but the pieces hadn't yet arranged themselves into a picture I could bear to look at. I closed my eyes, and in that fleeting moment, a memory from when she was little came flooding back. Vivian, not yet 5, holding a bunch of dandelions picked from the yard, running toward me with joy on her face. "Daddy, look, these are yours," she cried, her small hands holding the wilted flowers as if they were the most precious thing in the world. How had I gone from that moment, pure and full of love, to this rejection? But it didn't matter. I forced a forced smile, pretending, always pretending. "It's okay," I heard myself mumble, though my voice cracked like glass under the pressure. I backed away, looking for another chair, but everyone was taken. No one offered me a seat. No one looked me in the eye. I stood there alone, the father of the bride, abandoned like an unwanted guest. And in that moment I understood something devastating. Weddings aren't about love. They're about alliances, about power, about who gets to sit at the table and who doesn't. The shame cut deeper into me than any knife. But beneath the shame, something else rose. Something old, something I thought I had buried beneath years of patience and compromise. Anger, a quiet, seething anger that curled around my broken heart and whispered, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." Because if Jasper thought that pulling out a chair could erase me, if Vivian thought that looking away could cut off the bloodline, if Nancy thought that her complacent silence could silence me forever, they had all underestimated me. Today I may have been humiliated in front of everyone, but someday they will understand what it means to strip a mother of her dignity. They will understand that betrayal does not disappear in silence. It grows, it festers, and someday it will strike back. So I stood there, shaking but unflinching, my eyes fixed on the altar where my daughter would soon offer her life to the man who had just humiliated me, the man she had chosen over me, the man who had pulled out the chair. My hands clenched at my sides, my nails digging into my palms until I felt the blood burning. No one noticed, no one cared, but I did, and I promised myself, silently, furiously, that this story would not end with me standing there, forgotten, while they celebrated on their thrones. My name is Daniel, and for the better part of my life I had believed I was doing everything right. I was the kind of man who believed in hard work, who valued family above all else, and who would give everything to protect those I loved. But as I stood there, watching my daughter Vivian, the woman I had raised with every ounce of my being, move away from me, I realized I had failed somewhere. The man I had tried to be. Father I had tried to be, none of that seemed to matter anymore. I had always considered myself a decent father. I wasn't perfect, no one ever is, but I tried to be the kind of man Vivian would be proud of, the kind of man she could count on no matter what. I worked long hours, sometimes sacrificing my own dreams for the sake of hers. I spent sleepless nights worrying about her future, about her safety, and about the kind of world she would grow up in. And yet, here I was, an outsider at her wedding. I remember the early years before things started to change. I remember when Vivian was just a little girl, running around the house with wild hair and a loud, infectious laugh that would fill every corner. She had an imagination bigger than the universe itself, and her heart was just as expansive. As a child, she would run to me with scraped knees and tears in her eyes, but the moment I held her, everything would be better. I had always been her protector, her hero. As she grew older, I never stopped being there for her. I helped with her homework, I coached her through every heartbreak, and I celebrated every triumph, big and small. But somewhere along the way, something started to shift. It wasn't sudden, but it was undeniable. My daughter, the little girl who once ran to me for comfort, began to pull away. And it wasn't just the typical teenage rebellion I had expected. It was something deeper, something colder. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Was it the pressure of growing up, the desire to assert her independence, or was it something I had done or failed to do? Whatever it was, it gnawed at me every day. When she started dating Jasper, I didn't trust him. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he looked at me, that made my stomach turn. I tried to be welcoming, to give him the benefit of the doubt, but every interaction with him felt strained. He was polite, yes, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness, a sense of entitlement that made me uneasy. And the way Vivian looked at him, as though he were her whole world, well, that only made me feel more like an outsider. I tried to keep the peace. After all, she was my daughter, and I wanted her to be happy. But as the years went by, I couldn't ignore the subtle ways in which Jasper changed Vivian. She became more distant, more closed off. The conversations we used to have, the ones where we shared our fears and dreams, became fewer and farther between. She stopped calling as often, stopped coming over to visit, and when I did see her, she was always with him, Jasper. One evening I sat at the dinner table and I realized something that struck me like a punch in the gut. My daughter didn't need me anymore, at least not in the way she once had. She had a new family now, a family with Jasper, a family with his mother Nancy, who was cold and dismissive of me from the start. I saw the way she looked at me, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle in the way of Vivian's future. It wasn't hard to see that Jasper's mother had no interest in me, and I could feel the disdain radiating from her every time we crossed paths. It wasn't just that, it was the way Vivian changed around them, the way she allowed herself to become someone else, someone who barely resembled the little girl who once clung to me for comfort. As the wedding day approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost her for good. That morning I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie, wondering what happened to the father-daughter relationship we had once shared. I wondered if I had missed something, some sign along the way that would have told me this day would come. I had dreamed of this moment, watching my daughter get married, standing proudly at her side as she embarked on a new chapter of her life. But instead, I felt like I was standing in the background, a mere observer in a story that no longer included me. The wedding was everything Vivian had ever wanted. The venue was beautiful, an old grand hall with high ceilings and intricate chandeliers. The guests were a mix of family and friends, people who had been in Vivian's life for years, but there was an unmistakable distance between me and them. I was no longer a part of the inner circle. No longer a person whose opinion mattered. I was just her father, sitting on the outskirts of her life. As I walked into the venue, I couldn't help but notice the small details that spoke volumes. The way Jasper's family interacted with everyone, the way Vivian smiled at them in a way she had never smiled at me. I was a stranger in my own daughter's life. When it came time for me to take my seat, the moment that I had thought would be filled with pride and joy, it turned into something else entirely. I reached for the chair that had been set aside for me, my hand trembling slightly. I had expected this moment to feel like a culmination of everything I had worked for as a father, but as I lowered myself toward the chair, I felt it being yanked back sharply. I froze. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor rang louder than anything else. The orchestra, the chatter of guests, the soft laughter that rippled through the crowd. In that brief, terrible moment, I thought it was an accident, some mistake. Maybe Jasper didn't see me reaching for it. But when I looked up, his eyes met mine, and I saw that cruel smirk, the kind that told me this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. This was a message. The room seemed to go silent for a second. The guests at the tables around me didn't know how to react. Some gasped, others simply turned away, pretending nothing had happened. But I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, all of them silently asking the same question: what had I done to deserve this? I stood there, helpless. My hand still in the air, unable to move. It felt as though the floor had been swept out from under me. Vivian, my own daughter, looked over at me, and for a split second I hoped she would step in, would tell Jasper to stop, would tell everyone that this was wrong, but she didn't. She just looked away, adjusting her dress as if nothing had happened. In that moment, everything I had believed about family, about love, came crashing down. Vivian had become someone else. Someone who was willing to let this happen, to let me be humiliated like this, without a word of protest. And I realized, standing there, that this wasn't just about a chair. It was about everything I had lost. That day when I stood at the center of the hall, humiliated and abandoned, I still tried to put on a smile, fragile and weak as it was. After all, I was the father of the bride, and I couldn't let this humiliation break me right in front of all those eyes. But it was hard to pretend that everything was okay when it felt like I was being pushed out of the very family I had once been so proud of. Jasper, Vivian, and Nancy, they all stood there, drinking in my pain. They either didn't realize, or more likely, they didn't care. But at that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was the immense chasm that had opened between me and my daughter. It wasn't vague anymore. It was real. Vivian was no longer the little girl I raised. She had grown up and she had chosen her path. That path no longer included me. Then that's when it happened. As I stood there, still unable to sit in the chair that should have been mine, someone else came up to me. Daniel. A familiar voice spoke, warm but cold at the same time. I turned and saw Maria, my sister, standing there with concern etched in her eyes. We need to talk. The world around me seemed to stop. For the first time during the whole ceremony, I felt like everything had come to a halt. This odd, foreign feeling washed over me. Maria had never looked at me like this before. She had always been my pillar, the one I could turn to when everything fell apart. But now she stood there. Her gaze sharp, almost judgmental. Something had changed, something deep. I've been preparing myself for a lot of things today, being shunned, being pushed aside from Vivian's life. But this, I shook my head, hoping that whatever was coming next was just a misunderstanding. I couldn't have been ready for this. Maria, what's going on? I asked, my voice almost breaking. Vivian, what did she say about me? Maria hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting around. Then back at me, she looked like she was trying to choose her words carefully. Daniel, I don't want to say this today. I really don't, but there are some things you need to know about Vivian, about how she feels about you. A wave of dread crashed over me, my heart pounding in my chest. We had always been family, closer than anyone else, stronger than any blood ties could create. Maria had always been there to defend me, to stand by me in family disputes. But now she was standing on their side, on Vivian's side. Maria, did she really say that? I asked again, almost pleading, searching for any shred of hope that this was all a mistake. Maria nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. She said that she feels abandoned by you, that you don't understand her anymore, that you've stopped being the protector she needed. And there's more. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. More, I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. What more? Maria glanced around like she was checking if anyone could overhear. She motioned for me to step into a quieter corner, away from the bustling noise of the wedding. I followed her instinctively, my mind racing, but I could feel the walls closing in around me. This conversation was going somewhere I didn't want to go. She turned to me and the weight of her gaze hit me like a physical blow. Vivian, she doesn't want you in her life anymore, Daniel. She doesn't need you. She doesn't want to be close to you. And the thing is, she's made peace with it. I froze, my world spun for a moment. Vivian, my daughter, the girl I had given everything to, my own flesh and blood, the one I raised, loved, and protected. How could she turn her back on me? Maria, are you telling me that Vivian has really made this choice, that she doesn't want me involved in her life anymore? My voice wavered with disbelief. Maria nodded, her expression becoming more rigid. She's made it clear. She doesn't want you to be a part of her life the way you used to be. She doesn't need a father anymore, Daniel. She has Jasper. Jasper is the one who's taken your place. The words hit me like a sucker punch. They didn't just wound me, they shredded me from the inside out. Jasper, the man who had humiliated me earlier that day, had now become the one to replace me in Vivian's life. The man who had taken everything I thought I had, my dignity, my role as a father, and now my daughter's love. I could barely hear what Maria said next. Everything seemed to blur. How had it come to this? What had I done so wrong to deserve this? She doesn't need you anymore, Daniel, Maria repeated, her voice tinged with finality. She's decided this. I'm sorry, but you need to accept it. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't just the betrayal of Vivian. It was the realization that everything I had done, every sacrifice, every late-night worry, every ounce of love I had poured into raising her, it all seemed to mean nothing now. What did I do to deserve this? I had always been the one to protect her. I had always believed she would be the one person who would never turn her back on me, but now she had made her choice. And as I stood there, unable to process the reality of it all, I felt a deep, suffocating rage. How dare they take her away from me? How dare they erase me like this? She was my daughter, and no one was going to take her from me, not without a fight. I turned to Maria, my eyes filled with pain, anger, and a determination I hadn't felt in years. No, Maria, I will not accept this. I'm not just going to stand by and let them erase me from Vivian's life. She looked at me with pity, but there was nothing she could say to stop what was already set in motion. I'm sorry, Daniel, but sometimes we have to let go. Vivian has already moved on. I felt the weight of her words press down on me, but something inside me snapped. She was wrong. I wouldn't let go. Not like this, not without a fight. The world had already been shattering piece by piece, but when the final blow fell, it didn't just break me, it obliterated me. There's a moment in life when everything you've known, everything you've worked for, every ounce of strength and hope you've clung to vanishes, and for me it happened that night. I had no control anymore. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my chest tightened, and the weight of my sorrow hung heavy on me like an unbearable burden. I stood in that moment, lost in the suffocating flood of pain and confusion, surrounded by people who couldn't, or worse, wouldn't understand. I had already lost Vivian, I had already lost the sense of who I was, my place in this world, but I couldn't show it. I couldn't let anyone see me crumble completely, even though I was coming undone at the seams. The shame, the betrayal, the anger, it was all a storm inside of me, and I was struggling to keep it contained. The ceremony continued around me as if nothing had happened, as if I weren't standing there, broken, invisible, irrelevant. Every laugh, every toast, every congratulations felt like a dagger being thrust into my soul. They were celebrating, but they were celebrating my pain. They didn't know that, though. They didn't know how much it hurt. I found myself retreating step by step until I was outside, away from the eyes of the people who had once called me family, friends, and loved ones. It was as if I was searching for something to hold on to, something that could remind me of the person I used to be. But I didn't know who that person was anymore. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, indifferent light over everything. I felt the cool night air against my skin, but it couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped inside a suffocating void. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, the image of Vivian, my daughter, the girl I had nurtured, sacrificed for, loved with every inch of my soul, turning her back on me. It felt like someone had torn my heart out and left it to bleed in the cold. How did it come to this? How did I become so invisible in her life? I couldn't wrap my mind around it. She used to be my everything. I used to be the one she ran to when the world was too much for her. But now I was a stranger to her, and Jasper, that damn man, he had taken everything from me. He had erased me from Vivian's life. I could feel the fire of my anger rising. How dare he? How dare he think he could humiliate me, take my place? He wasn't her father. He would never be her father. The thought spiraled out of control, and soon enough, the anger boiled over. I slammed my fist against the brick wall of the house, the pain of it shooting through my knuckles, but it wasn't enough. It didn't stop the whirlwind of hurt that was tearing me apart inside. My breath quickened, and I staggered back, clutching at my chest as if I could somehow hold myself together. But I was falling apart. The tears came then, hot and sudden, pouring down my face like they had been waiting to break free. I couldn't stop them. I didn't want to. I sank to my knees on the cold stone path, my hands pressed to the ground as though trying to hold the earth together when my entire life was slipping through my fingers. I felt empty. I felt like I had been abandoned, not just by Vivian, but by everyone. I could hear the distant sounds of the reception inside, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the music playing softly in the background. It all felt so distant, so foreign. It wasn't my world anymore. I didn't belong there, not with them, not with Vivian, not even with myself. For a long time I stayed like that, kneeling on the cold ground, broken and alone, my sobs shaking my body. I didn't care anymore. I didn't care who saw me like this. I had already lost everything that mattered. I had nothing left to protect. I thought back to the years I had spent raising Vivian, those sleepless nights, the endless sacrifices, the moments when I'd put aside my own happiness for hers, and now it was all for nothing. I had given her everything and she had chosen him. The raw, unbearable truth crashed over me. I had been replaced. A new wave of agony washed over me as I realized how much I had failed her. I had failed to see the signs. I had failed to recognize the growing distance between us. I had failed to protect her from Jasper, from whatever dark influence he had over her. I had failed as a father. The guilt was suffocating. How could I have let this happen? How could I have let my daughter slip away like this? I stood up shakily, wiping the tears from my face, my mind still a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. I wasn't even sure what I was doing anymore. The man I used to be, the father who had once been a source of strength for Vivian, was gone, and in his place stood a hollow shell, a broken man who couldn't even find the strength to stand tall. I looked around at the empty yard, the quiet of the night swallowing me whole. There was no comfort here. There was no solace. I had no one to turn to. No one could understand the depths of what I was feeling. No one could fix this. And then in that moment of overwhelming isolation, a thought crossed my mind. Maybe this was how it was meant to be. Maybe I had been a fool to believe I could keep Vivian close forever. Maybe all the love and care I had given her wasn't enough to hold her, to keep her from drifting away. But even if that was true, it didn't make the pain any less. In fact, it made it worse. I was still a father, and fathers, no matter how much they hurt, still hold on to their children. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't let this be the end. The anger inside me flared again, but this time it wasn't just anger. It was something darker, something more primal. I wasn't just angry at Vivian. I wasn't just angry at Jasper. I was angry at myself. Angry that I had allowed myself to be stripped of my dignity, my place in my daughter's life. And as I stood there, the rage swirling within me, I knew something was beginning to change inside. This wasn't the end of the story. This wasn't the final chapter. I wasn't going to just fade into the background. This was just the beginning. The days following Vivian's wedding felt like a blur, each one blending into the next, a gray fog of memories and emotions that I couldn't escape. But amid the haze of devastation, something began to change inside me. I didn't realize it at first, didn't even acknowledge it as it happened, but eventually I noticed that I was no longer drowning in my sorrow. The weight of my grief, though still heavy, had started to shift, to feel different. I had always thought that when you lost someone, especially a child, you never fully heal, that the pain stays with you, cuts through you like a permanent wound that no salve could soothe, and to be honest, I wasn't sure I believed in healing. I had felt the sharpness of my loss too deeply, too intensely. How could a parent ever reconcile the feeling of being discarded, replaced, rendered invisible by their own flesh and blood? But somewhere in the middle of the endless, sleepless nights, I began to realize something. The intensity of the grief I was feeling, this suffocating, all-consuming pain, was not just about what had been taken from me. It was about what I had failed to see in myself. I had spent so much time focusing on Vivian's betrayal, on the way Jasper had pulled that chair away from me, on how I had been humiliated in front of everyone I knew, but I had never stopped to think about the one person who needed my attention the most, myself. In the quiet moments when the world outside was asleep, I began to listen to my own thoughts, to my own heart. I hadn't been paying attention to myself for years. My entire existence had revolved around Vivian's needs, around her life. I had sacrificed so much for her, but in doing so, I had forgotten who I was, forgotten that I too had a life, a voice, a worth beyond being a mother, a caretaker, a silent observer. I had been invisible to myself, but now in the solitude of my grief, I was beginning to see that I still had value. I still had a future, one that didn't depend on Vivian's choices or Jasper's whims. I wasn't defined by her rejection, by the void she had left behind. I was more than the woman standing in the shadows of their wedding. More than the broken mother who had been cast aside. I was a person in my own right, a woman with a history, a woman who had lived through countless trials, who had raised a daughter with love, who had fought battles on my own terms, even if no one else saw them. In that moment, something shifted in me. A door opened. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I took a deep breath and felt the weight in my chest ease just a little. I didn't have to keep wallowing in the past. I didn't have to let Vivian's betrayal or even Jasper's cruelty define me. I could choose to move forward to reclaim my life. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that, but for the first time in so long, I felt the stirrings of hope within me. It was a painful realization. I had to accept that Vivian, for all her faults, for all the pain she had caused me, was living her own life now. She wasn't the little girl who had needed me to guide her anymore. She was an adult with her own choices, her own journey, and I had to stop holding on so tightly to her, to what we had been, and start thinking about what I wanted to be too. I had spent so long wanting her love, wanting her approval, that I had lost sight of my own needs. I had been so desperate to hold on to the past, to the image of the perfect mother-daughter bond, that I hadn't seen the person I had become, a person who had a right to her own happiness, her own growth. It wasn't easy, but slowly I began to see that my worth wasn't tied to her approval. It wasn't tied to what others thought of me or what they saw in me. It was mine. I owned it, and I realized, too, that in order to truly heal, I needed to forgive not just Vivian and Jasper, but myself. I had carried so much guilt, guilt for not being the perfect mother, guilt for the times I had failed to see the signs that Vivian was pulling away, guilt for not doing more, being more, but now I knew that guilt was poison. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't change the choices I had made or the mistakes I had made along the way, but I could choose how to move forward. I could choose to forgive myself, to stop holding myself hostage to the expectations I had placed on myself. I could choose to forgive Vivian, not for her actions, but for the fact that she was her own person now. I couldn't control her anymore. I couldn't dictate her choices, and I had to accept that. And in accepting that, I found a strange sort of freedom. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Vivian and I would ever find our way back to each other. But I knew one thing: I was no longer going to wait for her to fix me. I was no longer going to let her choices, her silence, determine my worth. I was going to take my life back. The first step was simple. It was a small thing, really, but it meant the world to me. I went for a walk, alone. No one was there to tell me where to go, what to do, or who to be. I was free to think, to breathe, to just exist. And in that stillness, I realized something important. I had forgotten how to live for myself. I had spent so much time trying to make sure Vivian was happy that I had forgotten to nurture my own happiness. And so that's what I did. I started with the small things. I enrolled in an art class I had always wanted to take. I reconnected with old friends who had faded out of my life while I was so focused on Vivian. I started doing things for myself because I deserved it, because I mattered. The next day I called a therapist. I didn't know if I was ready to confront everything just yet, but I knew I couldn't do it alone anymore. I needed help, and for the first time in my life, I was willing to admit that. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. The wounds were deep and the scars would never fully fade. But I also knew that the greatest battle wasn't with Vivian or with Jasper. It was with myself. I had to let go of the past, accept the present, and move forward with courage, grace, and the understanding that I still had a place in this world. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. I was starting to remember who I was, and that was enough. The weeks after I began my healing journey were not easy. There were days when the weight of the past still clung to me, moments when the hurt threatened to resurface, but something had shifted within me. I was no longer the broken woman who stood in the corner of Vivian's wedding, humiliated and abandoned. I had found a part of myself that was stronger than I had known before, and as I rebuilt my life step by step, I knew that I had to stand up for what was right, not just for myself, but for the woman I had once been and for the dignity I had lost. I had started to find my voice again, the same voice I had used to raise Vivian, to guide her through life, to teach her the values I held dear. But this time I wasn't just standing up for her, I was standing up for me. I had spent too long trying to be the perfect mother, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to hold onto something that was never truly mine. Vivian had moved on, and it was time for me to do the same. But that didn't mean I was going to let the world walk all over me, as it had done for so many years. It didn't mean I was going to let the people who had hurt me go unchallenged. The first step in reclaiming my life was to finally confront the one person who had hurt me the most, Jasper. The man who had humiliated me in front of everyone, the man who had torn my daughter away from me with a simple, cruel gesture. I knew that confronting him wasn't going to be easy. He was powerful, charismatic, and had Vivian wrapped around his finger, but I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I had nothing left to lose. I'd spent too many nights tossing and turning, wondering if I would ever get the chance to speak my truth. But now, I was determined to make sure he understood that his actions had consequences. He had treated me like I didn't matter, but I was going to show him just how wrong he was. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that Jasper and Vivian were planning to host a celebration at their new house in a few weeks. It was going to be a gathering of friends and family, another chance for them to flaunt their perfect lives. A chance for them to continue pretending that everything was fine, that I was just a distant memory, but I wasn't going to let that happen. I would no longer be the invisible woman in their lives. I knew exactly what I had to do. The plan was simple. I had a speech prepared, one that I had written and rewritten 100 times. It wasn't just about confronting Jasper, it was about confronting Vivian too. It was about showing them both that I was not the woman they thought they could discard without consequence. I had spent years pretending that I didn't deserve more, that I should just quietly accept the role they had given me, but that was over now. I arrived at the party with my head held high, my heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and excitement. This wasn't just about me confronting the two of them, it was about reclaiming my life and my power. I could feel their eyes on me as I entered the room. Jasper, standing by the bar with a smug grin plastered on his face, immediately took notice of my presence. Vivian, standing beside him, froze for just a moment before quickly adjusting her posture, her smile faltering. They weren't expecting me. They weren't expecting the woman they had dismissed so easily to walk back into their lives with such confidence. But that's exactly what I was doing, and I wasn't going to let them forget it. I approached them, my steps deliberate, my face calm but resolute. I knew what I had to say, and I wasn't going to let fear or doubt get in my way. "Vivian," I said, my voice steady. "Jasper." I nodded toward him, the venom in my tone barely concealed. "We need to talk." Jasper's eyes narrowed, his grin faltering. He had expected me to be meek, to shrink away like I always had before. But that was no longer who I was. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as I held his gaze unflinching. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this is a private event," he said, trying to put on a facade of authority. I smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Oh, I know it's private," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But this is a conversation that needs to be had, and I'm not going to leave until it's over." Vivian's eyes darted between me and Jasper, the tension palpable. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the daughter who had once loved me, who had once turned to me for comfort, now standing beside the man who had torn us apart. "Mom, please, not here," she said, her voice low, her eyes pleading. I shook my head, feeling a mixture of sadness and determination. "No, Vivian. We need to have this conversation now. You've ignored me long enough, and I've let it happen. I've let you both push me to the sidelines, but not anymore." The room had gone quiet. People were beginning to notice, the air thick with anticipation. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me, waiting for the next move, and for the first time in a long time I wasn't afraid. "I don't know if you think I'm invisible or if you think I'm just going to disappear, but I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." I took a step closer to Jasper. "You pulled that chair away from me at Vivian's wedding. You humiliated me, but you're not going to get away with it. I won't let you." Jasper's face flushed with anger, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he looked to Vivian for support, but she didn't speak either. She stood there, caught between the two of us, unable to make a choice. I know you've been trying to erase me from Vivian's life, I continued, my voice rising, but you can't. I'm her mother, and no matter how hard you try, you can't take that from me. Not now, not ever. I paused, letting my words sink in. The room was completely still, and then I turned to Vivian. I don't know when you stopped needing me or when you decided I was no longer important, but I want you to know something. I took a deep breath. I didn't raise you to be like this. I raised you to be strong, to be kind, to be someone who values love above everything else. And this isn't love. This is manipulation, and I'm not going to stand by and let it continue. For a moment, Vivian said nothing. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't speak, and in that moment I realized something. I had spent so long trying to get her to see me, to understand my pain, but the truth was I couldn't make her change. I couldn't make her see what she was doing to me, but I could control what happened next. I've done my part, Vivian. I've loved you, protected you, and sacrificed for you, but I'm done being the villain in your story. I'm done being the person you push aside. I turned to Jasper one last time, and as for you, Jasper, I hope one day you'll realize what you've done, but until then I'll no longer be a part of your life. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding but my soul lighter than it had been in years. I had done it. I had reclaimed my power, and in doing so I had found the closure I needed. No longer would I be the person they walked all over. No longer would I shrink away into the background. This was my life. And I was going to take it back. The night stretched on, and the echoes of my confrontation with Vivian and Jasper still lingered in my ears. The tension in the air hadn't dissipated, but in that moment I found something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I stepped outside into the cool embrace of the evening air, where the moon hung low in the sky like a silent witness to everything that had transpired. The noise from the party had faded into the distance, but I could still feel the weight of it on my shoulders. Heavy like a shroud, it wasn't just the weight of the humiliation anymore. It was the weight of the years spent watching from the sidelines, of the love I had poured into my daughter only to watch her slip away from me. But tonight something had shifted. I had stood up for myself. I had faced the demons of my past and called out the lies. And though the pain hadn't disappeared, the chains that bound me to my own silence had been broken. I was no longer invisible. I wasn't just a mother who had been abandoned, a woman cast aside. I was a person with her own voice, her own truth. The silence around me felt different now, no longer suffocating, but rather liberating. I had spoken my truth. The confrontation was over, but my journey was far from finished. As I stood there, the quiet of the night was all I needed to reflect on what had happened, to let everything settle within me. The stars above seemed to blink in quiet understanding, their faint light a reminder that the world continued, even when everything around me had fallen apart. The wind stirred the leaves in the trees, and for a moment it felt like the earth itself was breathing with me. I thought about Vivian. I thought about the little girl who had once placed dandelions in my hands, about the woman who now stood beside a man who had caused me so much pain. In that fleeting moment, my heart ached, but it wasn't the raw, sharp pain of rejection anymore. It was something softer, something more profound, the understanding that the person she had become wasn't someone I could change. No matter how much I wished to pull her back into the warmth of my love, I couldn't. She had her own path to walk, and perhaps someday she would realize the consequences of her choices. But until then, I had to let go. I could feel the weight of the past years slipping away. One layer at a time. I had been her mother, yes, but I was also more than that. I was a woman, a person deserving of respect, dignity, and love that I had once freely given but had forgotten to give to myself. Jasper, I couldn't allow myself to harbor hatred for him. That would be too easy. I had learned that much. The truth was, he had only been a catalyst for the changes I had needed to make within myself. The anger I had felt had been necessary for me to reclaim my strength, but now it was time to release it. Holding onto the past would only keep me anchored in a life I no longer wanted to live. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze carry away the last remnants of bitterness. I had done what I needed to do. I had spoken the words I had kept silent for so long, and now it was time to let go. The world had not stopped turning. Life would continue, and I would continue to walk forward. But this time I would do it with my head held high, with a sense of peace in my heart, knowing that I was worthy of love, of respect, and of a future that was mine to shape. As I turned back toward the house, I felt lighter. The confrontation, though difficult, had been a necessary step in my journey. The silence of the night had allowed me the clarity I needed to understand one thing. No matter what had happened, no matter the pain or the rejection, I had not been broken. I had been reshaped. And in that reshaping, I had found my strength again. The door to the party stood open, the faint murmur of voices rising from within, but I knew I didn't need to go back in. The story that had unfolded that night had come to an end. The words had been said, and though they had changed everything, I didn't need the applause or the validation of others to feel whole again. I walked away from the noise, from the chaos, and into the silence of the night, where I could finally hear my own thoughts again. I could finally hear my own heart. This was my new beginning. A quiet, steady beginning without the weight of expectation, without the burden of what others thought I should be. It was a beginning built on truth, on self-respect, and on the knowledge that no matter how the world tried to define me, I was the one who got to choose who I would be. And as I walked, I knew I was no longer lost. I was free. Free from the past, free from the pain. Free to step into the future that awaited me. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story shocked you, made you feel something, or left you wanting justice served, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Share this story with your friends. Some truths only happen once, and we just witnessed a revenge plan unfold. Stay tuned for the next story. You won't want to miss it.